In this video, I'm going to begin the Asian model, the third of our three capitalist clusters. The ideological intellectual origins. Well, this model developed primarily in Japan and China, and it's going to be unique because of its geographic distance from the West. So the European and the Anglo model have some things in common because there was interplay with many of those countries, whereas Japan and China developed separately from the West. It's characterized by rapid economic growth and capital formation. The best example of this would be the Japanese economic miracle, which is what happened after World War II. For effectively 30 years after World War II, we saw growth rates in many years that were double digit. So it's called the Japanese economic miracle because remember, Japan was defeated in World War II, and this was effectively a period of rebuilding that ended with them being at one point the second largest economy in the world to the US. To understand the intellectual ideological origins, let's take a look at Japan's historical context. Now, there's a rich history here that we leave for the historians in those classes, but just a general overview. Japan was pretty isolated until it was opened by the US in 1854. A famous general effectively went in and did a very unilateral treaty, which said that Japan has to trade with the US, but not vice versa. That was a defeat to Japan, who had prided itself on being independent and powerful, and actually had an ethnocentrism that perceived outsiders as being somewhat inferior to the Japanese. So this was a challenge to all of that. And we see by 1868 what's known as the Meiji Restoration, which replaced a military regime with a progressive government that took on large-scale modernization. It actually changed their focus from being internal to external, a willingness to adopt ideas from the rest of the world, in particular Western ideas, that would help them advance their economy. The expansion under imperialist rule continued from 1868 to 1945, but there was a few important events in between. One, the occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. This is going to be important later because the ideas that Japan, kind of created traveled to Korea, which eventually would become independent and continue those ideas. So we're going to see, even though Japan founded the Asian model, today Korea is probably a better exemplification of this than Japan. But they annexed Korea during this period, and it's also worth noting that this is a bone of contention today. I think we talked about this in class, but Korea in general has a bit of animus towards Japan over the way people were treated during this period. And there's been attempts for apologies and reconciliation and all of that, but there is still tension between the two countries because of this wartime period. And we also would be remiss if we didn't mention that Japan, under Emperor Hirohito in 1941, bombed Pearl Harbor and became a major adversary of the United States. So the Japanese empire was definitely productive, but a lot of that productivity was ushered towards military endeavors. And it didn't quite work out because after 1945, Japan shifted again towards a democratic country with a constitution and actually became much more Anglo in its model thereafter. But the economic ideas that Japan was utilizing to advance its economy before and after World War II were spreading to other parts of Southeast Asia. And these countries, known as the Asian Tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, were the recipients of a lot of this knowledge. When countries trade, they not only trade goods, they also trade ideas. And usually the more powerful country economically is going to be able to imbue those ideas onto the less powerful countries. It's almost like a mentorship relationship, right? The weaker economies look to the stronger economies for their technology and their capital style. But when you look at these Asian tigers, you're not just seeing Japan's influence, you're also seeing a lot of Western influence. So don't forget that. The Asian tigers are very successful countries today. They have had extremely rapid growth with high rates of capital formation, and they have done this through many policies that, again, are a mix. Free markets, low taxes, minimal welfare states, export promotion, right? Really focusing on the rest of the world and producing products for them, as opposed to what's called import substitution, which is where you have your own producers substitute for importing goods. Well, that kills an economy, because if you're not going to allow imports to come in, other countries aren't going to buy from you. So it's got to be a two-way street, right? If you want to be a strong exporter, you must be a importer as well. Rapid demographic transition. Many of these countries went from agrarian economies where there's a large labor pool to industrial economies. So you got a lot of labor available moving into those cities and adding to the industrial base. Universal education, emphasis on literacy, brought about larger scale productivity. Remember, technology and ideas can only be assimilated in an environment where people understand them and can utilize them. And so universal education, being able to read, write, and do arithmetic, really sets the stage for assimilation of ideas quickly. All of these policies are important for the rapid expansion, but they're not the only policies, and they do vary from one country to another. So we're generalizing here, but the Asian tigers are an excellent example of poor, almost third world countries in standard of living in the 60s that are now some of the most prosperous countries in the world today, with Hong Kong and Singapore having among the highest per capita incomes in the world, and South Korea and Taiwan being commensurate with the first world countries like the US. Let's also consider where the Asian model influence comes from. When we talked about the European model, we learned that Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx had a lot of influence. In the Anglo model, John Locke and Adam Smith had a lot of influence. For the Asian model, we can look to Confucianism as kind of the basis for these ideas. And there's a lot of detail to Confucianism, obviously, beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but a few highlights are important to consider. The notion of a virtuous and powerful government, loyalty, nationalism, solidarity and collectivism, bravery and benevolence. These are going to give the Asian model distinction, because think about it. In the Anglo model, government is very utilitarian. We don't usually come together as a collective in the US because of our government. We come together because of shared ideas. Government is a means to perpetuate those ideas. Whereas in the European model, government does take on a more paternalistic role. There you could say, well, people do collectivize under government to try to provide charity, and to provide a safety net for those that can't provide for themselves. So there is more of that nobility in government in the European model. But it's at a whole other level under the Asian model, because government is perceived almost like the parent of the children of the nation. And that creates a support for government that wouldn't be there in these other models. Okay, let's talk now about some of the metrics. So this data here shows GDP per capita in 2011 terms. And I want you to note that Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, we would consider to be the high income Asian countries. And then you get over here to Malaysia, Thailand, China, Philippines, India, and Vietnam. These would be the lower income Asian countries. In fact, we already talked about Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea being the Asian tigers, but we have a term to describe some of these poor Asian countries that have a rapid rate of growth and have a high level of capital formation. They're called the mini dragons, and it includes Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and one that's not represented here, which is Indonesia. But the mini dragons are kind of doing today what the Asian tigers did, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So they're up and coming emerging economies that have a low per capita GDP, but they're sowing those seeds of the Asian model, the same seeds that Japan did a century ago, and the same seeds that these Asian tigers did decades ago. China we'll talk about in the last section of the course. They're a founder of what we consider the Asian model today, but they shifted course after World War II towards a planned socialist economy under Mao Zedong, and that continued into the late 70s, where they moved towards a more market socialist economy, which is what we probably consider them today. India is a unique challenge as well. India has a lot in common with the mini dragons. Growing rapidly, large capital formation, but India is the second most populous country in the world. India has a higher level of corruption than many other countries. And India has been resistant to opening up its economy to trade with the rest of the world. These have been hurdles that have prevented India from really reaching its potential. And it's to be determined as to where India will be moving into the future. India has a lot of potential, but they also suffer from low per capita income in several parts of the country and high income inequality. So we'll have to wait and see what model India adopts. Remember, India not only has Asian influence, but was a colony of Britain for a long period, which means they have British influences as well. It's a malleable kind of model that still has yet to be determined. Let's take a look at some of the growth data. This graph here shows decadal growth of the Japanese and 4 Asian tigers after World War II, so effectively after the 1950 period. So you'll notice Japan grew by a factor of 1.5 or 1.3 here in the 50s. And what that means is that from 1950 to 1960, the economy increased by 150%, more than double. That was even greater from 60 to 70. Okay, which would be a factor of 1.7 or 170%. And then it kind of dies down after that. You have the lost decade of the 90s, where Japan had no growth, and they've really had a hard time growing their economy since. For the Asian tiger countries, note that you have growth relatively high after World War II, and then into the 60s and even into the 70s, and then you start to see diminishing returns. It's not that they're not growing, they're actually growing quite well, but they're not growing as rapidly as they did after the war. And this is typical of industrial revolutions, right? You kind of reach that pinnacle of growth rates, and then it diminishes from there on. Let's take a look at the mini dragons now. Not as clear a pattern here, but if you look at each country individually, you'll notice that there is generally an increase and then a decrease. Look at Malaysia, for example. Growth in the 50s, even higher in the 60s, even higher in the 70s, drops off a little bit in the 80s, comes back in the 90s, and then drops off quite a bit in more recent times. However, the drop off here, the lowest point, is still almost a 60% increase in GDP in 10 years. So each of these countries will have some kind of similar pattern, and they're still growing well. That's why if you're an investor, you often like these mini dragons. They're called emerging markets, along with some other countries that are in that industrial phase and able to bring about larger returns on investment than might be possible in a more established first world country. All right, we'll wrap up there for this video and pick up in the next video with table 13.1. Thanks, guys. If you have questions, let me know.